The day started like any other. I was in my home office, barely halfway through my morning coffee, when a message popped up from an old college group chat. We hadn't all stayed in touch, but now and then, someone would check in, share a joke, or talk about the old times. I glanced at the message, just some random banter, and chuckled to myself, reminded of the good old days. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen. I could hear her humming softly as she moved about. We'd been married for 7 years now, and though there were ups and downs, I never suspected anything serious was wrong. Until recently. Lately, something had changed. Sarah had become distant. More irritable. I chalked it up to stress from her work, and she didn't deny it when I asked. But a small voice in the back of my mind told me something else was brewing. I just couldn't put my finger on it. That morning, as I sat working, Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter. It wasn't uncommon for her to leave it lying around, but this time something caught my attention. The name on the screen was Michael. I didn't know any Michael in her life, so naturally, my curiosity piqued. I approached the counter, but before I could look any closer, Sarah quickly snatched up the phone. "Who's Michael?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She shot me a look that made my stomach twist, part surprise, part anger. "Just a classmate from the fitness course I've been taking. I told you about it, remember?" I vaguely recalled her mentioning some course. I nodded, but something didn't feel right. "You didn't mention him before." "There's nothing to mention," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "He's just someone from the group." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the way she was clutching her phone tightly, not meeting my eyes, stirred something inside me. Before I could ask more, she changed the subject. "Are you going to finish your coffee before it gets cold?" Her deflection was obvious, but I let it go for the time being. Still, a knot had formed in my chest, one I couldn't quite shake. Over the next few days, things between us felt off. Sarah's mood swings were sharper, her patience thinner. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd get this nervous look on her face before quickly turning it off or stepping into another room to answer it. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, I decided to confront her. We were sitting on the couch, watching TV, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't let it go. I had to know what was going on. "Sarah," I began, turning down the volume. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me." She didn't look at me right away. "What are you talking about?" "This Michael guy. Why do you act so weird when he texts you?" Her jaw clenched. "I told you he's just a classmate. Why are you being so paranoid?" "I don't know, maybe because you've been acting strange lately," I shot back, my frustration spilling over. "You're constantly on edge and you hide your phone every time it goes off." "That's ridiculous," she snapped, standing up and crossing her arms defensively. "I'm not hiding anything. Why are you making a big deal out of nothing?" "Because it doesn't feel like nothing." I stood up too, now more frustrated than ever. "If it's nothing, then why won't you just show me the texts?" She glared at me, her face hardening. "You want to see the texts? Fine." Sarah shoved her phone into my hands, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I had overreacted. Maybe this was all just in my head. But as I scrolled through the messages, my heart sank. The conversation between her and Michael wasn't innocent. It was filled with flirtatious comments, suggestive remarks, and plans to meet up outside of the class. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice low but shaking with anger. She crossed her arms again, defiant. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think. You're flirting with him. You're planning to meet him alone." Sarah didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain herself. Instead, she threw up her hands and said, "I'm tired, okay? I'm tired of this marriage. I'm tired of you always being here, watching my every move." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean you're tired of this marriage?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back down on the couch, her head in her hands. "I don't know. I feel trapped, like I can't breathe anymore." I stood there, speechless. This wasn't the Sarah I knew. The woman I married was loving, patient, and caring. But now, sitting before me was someone I didn't recognize. "Is there something going on between you and Michael?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw guilt in her eyes. But then she shook her head. No, there's nothing serious. It's just, he listens to me. He understands me in a way that you don't anymore. Her words stung, but I wasn't sure if they were the whole truth. Something in her tone, in the way she avoided eye contact, told me there was more to this story. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out the truth. The days that followed that heated argument felt like I was living in a fog. Sarah didn't apologize for her words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only scratched the surface of what was really going on. Our once comfortable routine now felt strained, like every moment together was loaded with unspoken tension. That night, after we fought, I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying everything she had said. I feel trapped. Those words echoed in my head. We had our issues, but I never thought it was bad enough for her to feel that way. If Michael was nothing more than a distraction, why did it seem like something deeper was unraveling between us? Sarah spent more time out of the house in the following days. She said it was work or meeting up with friends from her class, but every time she left, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. One night, I decided to take a chance, follow her, and see if there was any truth to my suspicions. She left the house around 7 p.m., saying she had a late meeting with her study group. I watched her leave, but instead of giving in to the gnawing anxiety, I grabbed my car keys and followed her. I stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice, keeping a close eye on her car. To my surprise, she didn't head toward the school or any of the usual places she mentioned. Instead, she took a different route, toward a part of town that was quieter, filled mostly with old residential buildings. My heart started pounding. She pulled into a parking lot in front of an old building and parked. I drove past, making sure to keep out of sight, and parked a block away. From my car, I could see her walk inside without hesitation, no signs of hesitation or anxiety like she'd shown at home. I waited there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, every minute feeling like an eternity. After about half an hour, I couldn't sit still anymore. I got out of the car and walked toward the building, a mix of dread and anger building up inside me. As I approached the entrance, I caught a glimpse of someone through the window, a tall, muscular man with dark skin standing by the door, talking to Sarah. The sight of them together knocked the wind out of me. I quickly ducked back, hiding behind the corner of the building. My hands were shaking as I peered back around the edge, trying to get another look. There was no mistaking it. This man, Michael, was the same guy from her text messages. And now they were alone together in a secluded building. The realization hit me hard. She wasn't just having casual conversations with this guy. They were meeting in secret. Suddenly I felt sick. The bile rose in my throat as I imagined what might be happening behind those closed doors. I could hear their voices, muffled, but I was too far away to make out any words. My mind started racing, imagining all the worst possibilities. Was this the first time? Had this been going on for months, or longer? How had I missed it? My legs felt like they were glued to the ground. Part of me wanted to burst inside and confront them, demand answers, but another part of me wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to see the full extent of her betrayal. Instead, I turned and walked back to my car, shaking. I needed time to process what I had seen, to figure out my next step. Back at home, I sat in the dark living room, waiting for her to return. I stared blankly at the wall, my mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief. How had we gotten to this point? How had she gotten so far away from me, from us? When she finally came home, it was well past 10 p.m. I watched her through the window as she quietly opened the door, slipping inside like nothing was wrong. She didn't notice me at first, sitting there in the shadows. "Had a good study session?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. She froze, surprised to see me sitting there. "Yeah," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She didn't meet my eyes as she set her bag down. "It went long, but we got a lot done." I didn't respond right away. I just stared at her, wondering how she could lie so easily, so casually. My mind kept flashing back to that image of her with Michael, standing too close, too comfortable. The weight of her lies crushed down on me, making it hard to breathe. "I don't believe you," I finally said, my voice thick with emotion. She turned to face me, her expression guarded. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you, Sarah," I said, standing up from the couch. I followed you tonight. You weren't at any study group. You were with him. Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she dropped her gaze, her hands clenching at her sides. I didn't want it to come to this, she muttered, almost to herself. Come to what? I demanded, taking a step closer. What the hell is going on, Sarah? She finally looked up, her eyes cold and distant. I told you I'm tired. I don't want this anymore. I don't want you anymore. Her words were like a slap to the face. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. You don't want me? After everything we've been through? Sarah shook her head, her expression unrecognizable. I've been unhappy for a long time, and you never noticed. Michael, he's just the person who made me realize it. My hands balled into fists at my sides. So what? You've been sneaking around with him behind my back, lying to my face every day? And you think that's okay because you're unhappy? She didn't answer, and the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I was going to tell you, eventually. But I didn't want it to happen like this. My heart sank. The woman I had loved for so long, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. In her place stood someone I didn't recognize, someone who had no problem throwing everything away. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Sarah looked at me, her eyes cold. Maybe you never did. The house felt unbearably quiet after Sarah walked out of the room. The sound of the door shutting behind her echoed in my ears, and I sat down heavily on the couch, trying to process everything she had just said. I don't want you anymore. Those words reverberated in my mind like a gong, each repetition digging deeper into the cracks of my heart. I had known something was wrong, but nothing could have prepared me for the coldness in her voice, the finality in her tone. This wasn't just a rough patch, and it wasn't something that could be fixed by talking things through. It felt like the end. The woman I loved, who I thought I knew better than anyone, had slipped away from me, and I had no idea when or how it happened. But as much as her words hurt, there was something else gnawing at me, something darker. The way she had talked about Michael, as if he had given her clarity about our marriage, didn't sit right with me. She had never looked at me that way, with such indifference, and it made me wonder, had this really been going on for longer than I thought? I grabbed my phone and opened the group chat where Sarah had first mentioned her classmate, Michael. My fingers hovered over the screen, scrolling through old messages, but none of them mentioned him before last month. And yet, her connection to him seemed far too intense for something that had only just started. I needed to know more. My gut told me there was more to this than what she was letting on. Maybe I had been blind, too trusting, but that didn't mean I was going to stay in the dark forever. The next morning, while Sarah was out again, probably with him, I went through her things. I started with her phone, but she had changed the password. A new wave of dread washed over me. She had never kept secrets from me before, at least not like this. Then, I found her laptop on the kitchen counter. My hands shook as I powered it on, wondering if I was crossing a line, but I had to know. I needed answers. I tried the usual password she used for everything, and surprisingly, it worked. My heart pounded in my chest as the desktop loaded, and I immediately opened her email. There, buried under work emails and subscription newsletters, were a few messages from Michael. The first few seemed innocent enough, just casual talk about their fitness class. But the deeper I scrolled, the more intimate the conversations became. They were meeting regularly outside of class. Her tone with him was nothing like the way she spoke to me. It was flirtatious, almost affectionate. And then I found it, a message from Michael asking her to come over to his apartment later that week. The subject line was simple, "Can't wait to see you again." I felt sick. The confirmation I had dreaded was now staring me in the face. This wasn't just an emotional affair, this was physical. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what this meant. Sarah wasn't just unhappy, she had already moved on. She was using me as a safety net while she explored something with him. I slammed the laptop shut, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. My mind raced with anger, sadness, and confusion. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend everything was fine while she kept running off to be with him? Confront her and watch her lie through her teeth again? I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. But time wasn't on my side. That night, Sarah came home late again, her eyes barely meeting mine as she moved around the kitchen, making herself dinner. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was her with him, and the image made me want to scream. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, not yet. Instead, I watched her, looking for any sign of remorse, any clue that might tell me she was still struggling with what she had done. But there was nothing. She acted like she didn't care anymore, like she had already checked out of our marriage. "Did you see Michael today?" I asked casually, testing the waters. Her back stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "No," she said, her voice clipped. "I had other things to do." "Funny, you seem to be spending a lot of time with him lately," I pressed, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She turned to face me, her expression a mix of frustration and annoyance. "What are you getting at?" "I know you're seeing him," I said bluntly, standing up and meeting her gaze head-on. "I know what's been going on." For a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw the fear in her eyes. But just as quickly, she recovered, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "And what exactly do you think you know?" "I know enough," I said, my voice steady even though I was anything but calm. "I saw the emails, Sarah. I know you've been going to his place. Don't lie to me." Her face paled, and for a split second, I thought she might break down and tell me the truth. But instead, she squared her shoulders and glared at me, her jaw set in defiance. "So what if I am?" she shot back. "What difference does it make now?" Her words hit me like a brick. She wasn't even going to try to deny it. There was the confession I had been dreading. And yet, hearing her say it so coldly, so carelessly, broke something inside me. "So this is it?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "You're just going to throw everything away for him?" She didn't flinch. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm just moving on." "Moving on," I repeated, incredulous. "We've been married for 7 years, Sarah. You don't just move on from that. You don't sneak around behind your husband's back and act like it's no big deal." "Maybe you should have seen it coming," she said, her voice cold and detached. "Maybe if you'd paid attention, you would have realized a long time ago that I wasn't happy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was putting this on me, making it seem like I was the reason she had cheated. My hands balled into fists at my sides, and for a moment, I was too stunned to respond. "This isn't my fault," I finally said, my voice low but firm. "You're the one who decided to betray me. You're the one who broke our vows." Sarah's face twisted in anger. "Vows? Don't talk to me about vows. You were never there for me when I needed you. You were always too busy with work, with your own life. I was just an afterthought." Her words stung, but I wasn't going to let her rewrite history. "That's not true, and you know it. I was there. I loved you. I still do. But you didn't even give me a chance." She shook her head, her expression hardening. "It's too late. I've already made my choice." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy fog. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in the reality of what was happening. Sarah wasn't coming back. She had made up her mind, and nothing I said or did was going to change that. I wanted to scream, to beg her to reconsider, to ask her why. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. She had already made her decision, and no amount of pleading or reasoning would bring her back to me. As she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there in stunned silence, I realized that the woman I had loved for so many years was gone, and there was nothing I could do to get her back. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy weight on my chest, like the world had shifted overnight, and I was struggling to keep up. Sarah's words from last night echoed in my mind, her cold confession, her detached indifference. It felt surreal, like I had been living in someone else's nightmare. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Every room felt like a prison, the air thick with the memory of our failed marriage. I needed space to think, to clear my head, so I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove, letting the road carry me away from everything. For the first time in a long while, I felt utterly lost. Sarah had made her decision, and I was stuck, not knowing how to pick up the pieces of my life. There had to be more, something deeper, something that explained why she'd been so willing to throw everything away. Was it really just about her unhappiness, or was there something else? The thought gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I drove aimlessly for hours, and by the time I found myself parked outside of Michael's apartment building, I realized that my subconscious had been leading me here all along. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, confront him, scream, demand answers, but something inside me needed to see him, to face the man who had come between me and my wife. I stepped out of the car and stared at the building. Part of me wanted to march up there, knock on his door, and tell him exactly what I thought of him. But I stopped myself. That would only give him power, and I wasn't about to let him have that satisfaction. Instead, I walked around the block, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. As I rounded the corner, I caught sight of a familiar figure leaving the building. It was Sarah. My breath caught in my throat, and I ducked behind a parked car, watching her walk to her car with a determined, almost carefree expression on her face. She had changed into a casual outfit, jeans and a light jacket, and she looked like she didn't have a care in the world. Like she wasn't betraying her husband. Like she wasn't tearing apart the life we had built together. She got into her car and drove off without noticing me. My fists clenched at my sides as I watched her leave, my mind racing. I had suspected their affair had been physical, but seeing her walk out of his place confirmed it in the most painful way possible. This wasn't just an emotional connection. It was real, tangible, and right in front of my eyes. When she was gone, I stood there for a moment, frozen in place. I couldn't shake the image of her leaving his apartment, looking so comfortable, so at ease. There was no sign of guilt, no hesitation. I couldn't understand how she could be so cold about it, so indifferent to the damage she was causing. I didn't confront Michael that day. Instead, I went home, determined to uncover the truth. If Sarah was going to throw our life away, then I at least deserved to know why. I needed to understand what had changed between us, what had pushed her into his arms and made her decide that I was no longer enough. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I stayed up, poring through every detail of her life that I could access. Her laptop, her emails, even her social media accounts. I wasn't proud of snooping, but I had no choice. I needed to know everything. As I sifted through her messages, I found more emails between her and Michael, each one more intimate than the last. But it wasn't just their affair that caught my attention. I found something else, a series of emails that she had sent to someone I didn't recognize, discussing plans that had nothing to do with Michael. Plans that involved me. The emails were vague, but the tone was clear. Sarah wasn't just planning on leaving me. She was planning on making sure I was out of the picture entirely. The conversation mentioned lawyers, assets, and something that sent a chill down my spine. Divorce wasn't enough for her. She wanted me out of her life completely, and from the sound of it, she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get there. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing. It wasn't just an affair. She wanted to destroy me, to take everything I had built and leave me with nothing. For what? What had I done to deserve this kind of betrayal? I needed to confront her, but not yet. I needed more. I had to find out exactly how deep this went, and who else was involved. As I searched through her messages, I found a name that kept popping up, Rebecca. It wasn't a name I recognized, but from the tone of the messages, it was clear that this Rebecca was a key player in whatever Sarah was planning. I did a quick search on social media, and it didn't take long to find her. Rebecca was an old classmate of Sarah's, someone she had reconnected with about a year ago. They had grown close, meeting up regularly, and from the looks of it, Rebecca had a history of bad relationships and bitter breakups. Her social media posts were filled with anger and bitterness toward men, and it became clear to me that she had been feeding Sarah's resentment toward me, encouraging her to take drastic action. The pieces started to fall into place. Rebecca wasn't just a friend, she was the catalyst for everything that was happening. She had planted the seed in Sarah's mind, convincing her that I was the problem, that she deserved better, and that the only way to move on was to cut me out of her life entirely. I felt sick. It wasn't just about Michael. Sarah had been planning this for months, maybe longer. The affair was just part of a larger plan to leave me with nothing, to make sure I was erased from her life as completely as possible. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a wave of rage washed over me. I had been blindsided by the affair, but this was something else entirely. She had been plotting against me, using me as a pawn while she prepared to destroy everything we had built together. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had all the facts. I needed to know exactly what she was planning and how far she was willing to go to get rid of me. So, I made a decision. I would play along. I would pretend that I didn't know anything, that I was still the oblivious husband. I would gather as much information as I could, and when the time was right, I would expose everything. Sarah, Michael, and this Rebecca who had poisoned her mind. It was a dangerous game, but I had no choice. I couldn't let her win. Not like this. The days that followed were a blur. Every morning I woke up beside Sarah, pretending not to know the depths of her betrayal, forcing myself to smile and act like nothing was wrong. The tension between us was palpable, but she seemed relieved by my sudden willingness to let things go. Maybe she thought I had accepted her infidelity, that I was too broken to fight back. But in reality, I was preparing for the storm. Every moment she spent with Michael, every message she sent to Rebecca, was another piece of evidence I quietly collected. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had everything I needed to expose her plan and protect myself from whatever twisted scheme she was plotting. Sarah had no idea I had gained access to her phone's cloud backup. Every conversation she had, every message she sent, synced to an account I had quietly linked to my own devices. I read everything. Her flirtations with Michael, her secretive talks with Rebecca, and worst of all, the cold calculations she was making to ensure I would be left with nothing. One message, in particular, stood out. It was a conversation between her and Rebecca that happened a few days after our confrontation. Sarah, I told him. He knows about Michael. Rebecca, good. It was time to stop pretending. How did he take it? Sarah, he's acting like he doesn't care. I think he's too stunned to do anything. Rebecca, typical. Men like him never see it coming until it's too late. Sarah, I just want this over with. He's been so pathetic lately. I can't stand being in the same room as him. Rebecca, don't worry. Once we move to the next step, you'll never have to deal with him again. The callousness in their words made my skin crawl. Sarah spoke about me like I was an inconvenience, a burden she couldn't wait to shake off. And Rebecca, she was pushing Sarah to take things further, to get rid of me completely. I had to admit they had been careful. There were no explicit mentions of violence or any illegal plans, but the undertone was there. Whatever Rebecca was suggesting, it wasn't just about divorce. They were plotting to ruin me, financially and emotionally. And Michael, he was just a pawn, a convenient distraction while they set the stage for my downfall. I needed to act, but I still didn't have the full picture. Sarah wasn't reckless enough to lay out everything in her messages. There were phone calls, face-to-face meetings with Rebecca, and the occasional disappearance for hours where I had no idea where she went. I knew she was careful, but I also knew that if I played my cards right, she would slip up. And then she did. It was a Friday evening. Sarah told me she had to meet with a client for dinner, something related to work, and that she would be home late. I pretended to accept it, but as soon as she left, I followed her. This time, I was more prepared. I had installed a tracking app on her phone, and it led me straight to a small, upscale restaurant on the edge of town. But when I arrived, it wasn't Michael waiting for her inside. It was Rebecca. They sat in a corner booth, away from the windows, their heads close together. I parked across the street, watching them through the window, trying to decipher their body language. From the way Sarah was nodding, it was clear they were discussing something serious. Rebecca seemed to be leading the conversation, her hands gesturing animatedly, while Sarah listened, occasionally glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. I waited for over an hour, watching them talk. My mind raced with all the possibilities. What were they planning? Were they discussing how to take me down, how to make sure I couldn't fight back? I was tired of playing the passive observer. I needed to know what they were saying. So, I made a risky decision. After Sarah and Rebecca left the restaurant, I followed them, carefully, making sure not to get too close. They drove to Rebecca's apartment, a sleek building in a part of town I rarely visited. I parked a few blocks away and waited until they went inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I slipped out of the car and approached the building. It wasn't hard to find a way in. The door to the side entrance had been left ajar, and I slipped inside unnoticed. I knew I was taking a huge risk, but I had no other choice. I had to know what they were planning. I found their apartment easily enough. Rebecca lived on the ground floor. I crouched outside the window, careful to stay out of sight. From where I was, I could hear snippets of their conversation through the slightly open window. My blood ran cold as I caught bits and pieces of their discussion. "I'm telling you, it's the only way," Rebecca was saying, her voice low but intense. "He's not just going to roll over and let you take everything. You have to make sure he can't fight back." Sarah's response was muffled, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. "I know that, but I'm not sure I can go through with it. It's complicated." "Nothing's complicated," Rebecca shot back. "You do this and it's over. No more pretending. No more dealing with him. He'll be out of your life for good." I couldn't hear everything, but the tone of the conversation was enough to confirm my worst fears. Rebecca was pushing Sarah to make a move, to cut me out of her life in a way that went beyond divorce. I didn't know exactly what they were planning, but I knew it was dangerous. And I knew that I couldn't wait any longer. I had enough evidence now, enough to prove Sarah's betrayal, enough to show that she was planning something malicious. I needed to take everything I had collected and bring it to someone who could help. A lawyer, maybe. Or even the police. I wasn't sure yet, but I knew that the time for waiting was over. That night, when Sarah came home, she acted like everything was normal. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my evening was. I played along, pretending not to notice the weight of her lies pressing down on both of us. But inside, I was seething. The next day, I took the first step toward ending this nightmare. I contacted a lawyer, someone discreet, someone who could help me prepare for what was coming. I didn't know what Sarah and Rebecca were planning, but I wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. I would be ready. As I sat in the lawyer's office, going over the evidence I had gathered, I felt a strange sense of relief. The betrayal still hurt, but now I had a plan. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was going to protect myself, no matter what Sarah or Rebecca tried to do. I left the office that afternoon with a sense of purpose. I was done playing the victim. Now, it was time for Sarah to face the consequences of her choices. The days following my meeting with the lawyer felt like I was walking on a tightrope. Every conversation with Sarah was a performance, every smile a lie. I kept my emotions in check, but it was exhausting. I was gathering all the pieces, waiting for the right moment to make my move. My lawyer had advised me to bide my time, to wait until I had everything in order. But patience was running thin. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease. If she noticed the change in my demeanor, she didn't let on. She continued her routine, leaving for hours at a time, pretending to be at work or at a client meeting, but I knew where she was really going. The tracker on her phone confirmed it every time. She was seeing Michael. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I became. The woman I had loved for so many years had betrayed me in every way possible. And yet, as the days passed, I began to notice something else. She wasn't just spending time with Michael. She was meeting with Rebecca more frequently, too. And with each of those meetings, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. There was something bigger going on, something Rebecca was pushing her toward. And I was determined to find out what it was before it was too late. One evening, I decided to confront Michael directly. It was risky, but I needed to know what role he was playing in all of this. Was he just a pawn in Sarah's plan, or was he involved in whatever she and Rebecca were plotting? I waited until Sarah left the house. She said she was meeting Rebecca for drinks, but I knew she was heading to Michael's place. Once she was gone, I drove to the same apartment building where I had followed her before. My heart pounded as I knocked on Michael's door. I had no idea how this would go, but I wasn't backing down now. When the door opened, he looked surprised. Clearly, he hadn't expected me. "You Michael?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, looking me up and down. "Yeah. And you are?" "Sarah's husband," I said bluntly. His face changed instantly, going from confusion to discomfort. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble." "I'm not here to fight," I interrupted. "I just want to talk." He looked like he was about to shut the door in my face, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't coming at him with fists raised, or maybe he sensed the desperation in my voice. Either way, he stepped aside and let me in. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, the kind of place you'd expect from someone who wasn't looking to settle down. I sat on the edge of the couch while he hovered awkwardly by the door. "I know about you and Sarah," I said, getting straight to the point. "I've known for a while." He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know she was married at first." "That doesn't change the fact that you kept seeing her after you found out," I shot back, my anger bubbling just below the surface. He nodded, looking ashamed. "I know. I'm not proud of it." "Is it just an affair for you?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Or are you involved in something bigger?" Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean Rebecca," I said, watching his reaction closely. "I know she's been talking to Sarah. I know they're planning something. I just don't know what." For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. "Rebecca? I don't really know her. Sarah's mentioned her a few times, but we've never met." That threw me off. If Michael wasn't part of whatever Sarah and Rebecca were planning, then what was his role in all of this? Was he really just the affair partner, or was there something more? "Sarah's not just having an affair," I said, my voice low. "She's planning something to take me down. And Rebecca is helping her." Michael looked taken aback. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "Dead serious." For a moment, he just stared at me, processing what I had said. Then, to my surprise, he sat down on the couch across from me. "Look, man, I didn't know about any of this. I swear. Sarah never talked about you, except to say she was unhappy. I didn't even know she was married at first, and by the time I found out, I was already, well, you know." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my anger in check. "So you didn't know anything about her plans?" He shook his head. "No. I'm just as surprised as you are." I don't know what I thought. I didn't think it was this serious. I wasn't sure if I believed him. Part of me wanted to think he was lying, that he was just as guilty as Sarah and Rebecca. But something about the way he said it made me hesitate. Maybe he really was just a pawn in Sarah's game, used to distract me while she plotted behind my back. "Then stay out of it," I said finally, standing up. "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave Sarah alone and get as far away from her as possible. Whatever she's planning, you don't want to be involved when it all comes crashing down." Michael didn't argue. He just nodded, looking pale. "I'll talk to her," he muttered. "I didn't sign up for this." I left without another word, my mind racing. If Michael wasn't involved in the deeper plot, then it was all coming from Rebecca. And that meant Sarah was more dangerous than I had realized. When I got home that night, Sarah was already back, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good day." I forced a smile. "Yeah, busy." She didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. We both sat there in silence, pretending like nothing was wrong, like our lives weren't about to explode. But inside, I was preparing for the final move. I had all the evidence I needed, and I knew exactly what to do next. The next morning, I met with my lawyer again. I handed over everything: Sarah's emails, the texts with Rebecca, the tracker logs, the cloud backups. We went over every detail, building a case that would expose Sarah's affair and her plans to sabotage me. "I'll file the divorce papers tomorrow," my lawyer said, looking over the documents. "We have more than enough to prove infidelity and malicious intent." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. This was it, the end of everything. That night, I sat across from Sarah at dinner, watching her closely. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that the life she had so carefully planned to destroy was about to turn against her. After dinner, I handed her the envelope. She looked confused as she took it, her fingers fumbling with the seal. When she pulled out the papers and saw what they were, her face went white. "Divorce?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't say anything. I just watched her as she processed what was happening. This isn't how it was supposed to go," she stammered, her hands shaking. Rebecca said." "I know what you and Rebecca have been planning," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I know everything. The affair, the lies, the plan to ruin me. It's over, Sarah. She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. You don't understand. No, I interrupted. You don't understand. You lost, Sarah. You tried to destroy me, but you destroyed yourself. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mask of shock. And then, without another word, she stood up and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I sat there, alone, in the house that we had once shared, the silence heavy around me. It was over. The storm had passed.